learners and viewers, welcome to this session. You all must have joined in this course Gender Auditing and Gender Budgeting, and you have all must have already gone through the few videos regarding gender budgeting and gender auditing. Today's topic is tools and methodologies. These tools and methodologies specifically they have developed to implement the gender budgeting at the national, subnational as well as local levels. This lecture draws largely on Commonwealth experiences. I have given the references in this lecture. If you want to further learn about these tools and techniques and methodologies, you can go through these references and you can learn more and more about these tools and technologies. This lecture focuses on the underlying principles behind the application of the expenditure tools. Learning outcomes of this session is to describe expenditure tools, explain the different types of expenditure tools, and examine the methodology to implement gender budgeting. These are the three learning objectives as far as today's session is concerned. Let us see what is expenditure tools. You all must be wondering, how do we define expenditure tools? In countries where gender response budget initiatives have been implemented, these tools have been used selectively, usually on an incremental basis. Of their use is informed by their perceived utility in addressing the gender issues with society and their compatibility with public policy management systems and procedures. Basically, if the government, they collect taxes and revenues and they accumulate the resources and they need to know how to spend these resources for the benefit of the society. So, these expenditure tools certainly will help us to know how to incorporate gender concerns in the budgeting process. Tool 1. First tool is that gender aware policy appraisal. The gender aware policy appraisal is the analysis of the policies and programs funded through the budget, which ask in what ways are the policies and their associated resource allocations likely to reduce or increase gender inequality. Whatever policies the government would like to implement, first question we need to ask in what ways these policies and associated resource allocations likely to reduce or increase gender inequality. Once you start asking this question, certainly we try to analyze whether the existing policies are policies the government planning to implement. Then we analyze from a gender perspective. Accordingly, one can provide certain policy prescriptions to the government to make that policy more gender responsive. When we talk about gender aware policy appraisal, we need to comment. Government budgets, like many other economic policies, we all know that have perceived as a gender neutral policy improvements. All of us, they think that whatever the allocations they are making, the government assumed that those allocations certainly will benefit both male and female. But the existing socialization process and various issues related to gender that made existing resources may not be able to address the needs of the females and girl children in the society. Thus, the expenditure and revenue are specified in terms of financial aggregates, and the impacts of categories or subcategories of expenditure or revenue are judged largely on their impact on the overall budget deficit or surplus. Basically, what the government will do is that whatever the allocation is made, the assumption is that those allocations certainly will bring changes in the life of the positive changes in the life of the each and every population in a particular country. Thus, it assumed that the policies are gender neutral. But due to the patriarchy and existing socialization process, it will have a different impacts on male, female, girl children and boys. Thus, we need to analyze the existing policies from a gender perspective. Then only we could come to know that what are the roles played by the male and what are the roles played by the female in the society. Accordingly, their needs will differ. Based on their needs, the government has to allocate enough resources to address the needs of each and every category of the population in the society. But in expenditure and revenue are specified in terms of financial aggregates, and the impacts of categories of subcategories of expenditure or revenue are judged largely on their impact on the overall budget deficit or surplus. The absence of reference to women or men for that matter is judged to be evidence of gender neutrality. But Diane Elson, 1999, argues this appearance of gender neutrality is more accurately described as gender blindness. Different revenue raising measures and public expenditure allocations impact women and men differently because of the socially determined roles they play in the economy, whether as a contributors to economic output and social reproduction or as beneficiaries of public expenditure and users of public services. This we need to understand that. For example, I could give you this example. Based on this example, as a learner, you could able to understand the need for looking the policies from a gender perspective. The South African land reform program is proceeding at an increasing pace with corresponding increases in expenditure for everything from owner compensation to microfinance programs. However, women's access to land as well as to financial resources necessary for its development is impeded by legal restrictions on women's land ownership and rights to conclude contracts. Women who do not have access to land tend to have an access to smaller plots with poor irrigation, and women-headed households typically have no wage or salary earners. As a result, women are far less able to benefit from the reform process and related expenditure. The Department of Land Affairs have started to integrate gender concerns into its monitoring and evaluation systems and has begun providing gender training staff. This example clearly helps us to understand the need for looking at any policies from a gender perspective. Even if they have in South Africa, even if they have implemented land reform program to reform the existing land and try to provide access to land to the women, but still due to the lack of gender sensitivity, women who don't have an access to land tend to have an access to smaller plots with poor irrigation, and women-headed households typically have no wage or salary earners. This clearly shows that how gender insensitivity make the women become marginalized even if the government bring certain reforms in the existing policy measures. To address these policy gaps, it is important for the government to provide gender training to all their staff and implementing officials. Whoever implementing particular program, they should get trained the existing gender differences in the society. Once they get trained, once they begin gender sensitive, then they could be able to implement the existing policies and programs in a gender transformative manner. The second tool is gender disaggregated public expenditure incidence analysis. This gender disaggregated public expenditure and incidence analysis estimates the distribution of budget resources among males and females by measuring the unit cost of providing a given service and multiplying that cost by the number of units used by each group. Traditionally, when we talk about public spending in any sector was assumed to be distributed equally across the beneficiary population, whether national, provincial or municipal. In many cases, equal distribution of benefits have not occurred, especially among poor compared to other income groups in rural areas compared to urban, or among females compared to males. However, such potential bias can only be determined through the collection of data. In this context, data specific to gender impacts. We have to collect massive data, that to genders disaggregated data, to know the gender impacts. Moreover, a central function of public spending is distributed equity. But in a view of widespread spending constraints, a solution adopted by many governments is targeting, that is, concentrating limited public resources on narrowly defined target groups, usually those most at risk. As Dr. Elson pointed out, given that men, even poor men, tend to spend more of their available income on personal, lesser pursuits, there is a gender dimension to optimizing targeting strategies to valuable households or groups by making benefits accessible through women instead of men. For an example, I could able to give you an example from Sri Lanka's food ration and subsidy program in the 1980s revealed that despite rapid economic growth, the real value of food stamps eroded in the first half of the decade, and there was a decline in real incomes of poor people. It concluded that within poor households, girls and women bore the brunt of the rising food deficit, citing higher levels of malnutrition among preschool and school girls and declining birth weights of babies born to low-income mothers. This example certainly will help you to understand that even if the government is providing food stamp program, or like even if the government is transferring certain amount to the families, for example, if the government considered family as a unit, most of the time we assumed that the head of the family mostly a male members. Then that amount will directly goes to the male members. If the amount goes directly to the male members, their spending nature is different compared to female members in a particular society. Thus, the government needs to be more gender sensitive in implementing certain policies, specifically if they transfer direct, like if they do direct benefits to the particular individuals, the government needs to consider transferring that benefits directly to the female instead of male members in a particular family. The third significant tool with regard to gender budgeting implementation is that gender disaggregated beneficiary assessments. When we talk about gender disaggregated beneficiary assessment, is a means by which the voice of the citizen can be heard. In these exercises, the actual or potential beneficiaries of public services are asked to assess how far public spending is meeting their needs as they perceive them. This can be done through the opinion polls, attitude surveys, group discussions, or interviews. Questions focus on overall priorities for public spending or upon the details of the operation of the public services. Like we can give an example of public expenditure management is an increasingly seeking to integrate development concerns, particularly those relating to social inclusion, human resource development, and poverty reduction within the budgetary requirements of fiscal prudence, economic growth, and political realism. This is undoubtedly a necessary but difficult task for governments which have limited resources for financing various social priorities and to make hard choices in the face of competing demands. Although public expenditure management is one of the most critical areas of public policy, it is possibly the least publicly examined because it is highly technical. However, civil society organizations are increasingly looking at public expenditure management and service delivery and its public responsiveness. The World Bank Program on Civic Engagement in Public Expenditure Management promotes the democratization of resource management. This participatory budget process, initiated by the government, offers opportunities for redistribution and more direct accountability through organized budget debates with citizens, a review of investment plans of the previous year, and a discussion of proposals for the new year, a ranking of demands and aggregate community claims, and a division of resources based on the weighting system that combines subjective preferences of citizens with objective quantitative criteria. I could give you an example for this tool. In 1996, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom initiated a women's budget project asking women to answer a series of questions about the choices they would make in allocating national budget resources. They calculated the cost of various defense-related programs and compared them to potential social welfare expenditure. The project then asked, which would you choose? Fund the F-22 fighter plane program for the current year or pay for the annual healthcare expenses for 1.3 million American women? Fund Sea Wolf attack submarines for the current year or private low-income home energy assistance for 5.6 million households. These are the questions they have asked. The project estimated the savings from the proposed cuts in military spending and outlined the ways in which such savings could be invested to benefit women, including employment and training programs, campaigns against gender-based violence, and services for the elderly and majority whom are women. The fourth significant tool is that sex disaggregated analysis of the impact of budget or time use. You all must have heard about the term time use survey. Let us see what is gender disaggregated analysis of the impact of the budget on time use as part of the tools for implementing gender budgeting. Sex disaggregated analysis of the impact of the budget on time use is a calculation of the link between budget allocations and their effect on how household members spend their time using household time use surveys. Like I could able to comment on this sex disaggregated analysis of the impact of budget on time use. In this, social reproduction entitles cost, the cost of the caring for ourselves, our children, and the dependents. These costs include direct expenditure on the behalf of the dependents, such as children, the sick, the disabled, and the elderly, along with the cost of the time devoted to the care of these individuals and to the daily maintenance of families and community networks. For individuals and families, costs include the direct cost of children, the time spent caring for children, the cost of education, and the other cost of raising children. On a larger scale, social reproduction costs also include the cost of maintaining society's stock of knowledge and abilities, although these can also be thought of as part of the economic reproduction. While both men and women contribute to social reproduction, women generally contribute disproportionately larger amounts of their disposable income and labor to this process. Mostly, the existing studies, all studies conducted on women, how they spend on their leisure time, on their time as well as their income, they come to the conclusion that women, they spend their time and their income for the well-being of the entire family members. Unlike male members, they spend their time and amount for their own leisure. Equally significant is the link between social reproduction and the market economy. They form the social production, supplying the human and social capital for the later, like for the market economy. While there have been important developments in family-friendly policies offered through budgets, including family tax credits, child benefits, and single-parent allowances, the impact of budgetary policy on social reproduction has been largely negative through reductions in social expenditure and or the introduction of user fees for social services. We will discuss more about the impact of user fee for social services in a later lecture. this introduction of user fee for social services, how it impacts specifically on women, needs to be discussed in detail. That we will separately, we will have one lecture and we will discuss in detail. For an example, for these tools, between 1983 and 1985, real per capita expenditure on health fell by 16% in Zambia. In Zambia, people had to travel greater distances and wait for longer periods of time to get healthcare treatment. Zambian women who were interviewed reported having to spend more time caring for sick family members, including time spent with them in hospital, providing meals and nursing care, and having less time to spend on farming. This clearly shows that if we reduce the expenditure on social security measures, that will have a negative impact on women. Then the women, they are supposed to take care of the existing socialization process, expect the women to take care of the children, elderly and sick people. If the government has reduced the expenditure on health and education, and if they are not if they are not developing more and more public sector units like hospitals and public schools, it may have a negative impact on women, and they need to they need to spend more time on taking care of the family members rather than doing certain economic activities. Thus, it impacts negatively on women as well as and other family members in the society. The fifth tool with regard to gender budgeting implementation is that gender-aware medium-term economic policy framework. A gender-aware medium-term economic policy framework is used to assess the impact of economic policies on women, focusing on aggregate fiscal, monetary and economic policies designed to promote globalization and reduce poverty. Based on the advantages of linking policy planning and budgeting, the medium-term budget policy or expenditure framework sets out the policy framework usually for the 3-year rolling budget. It describes the government's goals and objectives, explains the economic environment within which those objectives are being addressed, and projects the total level of resources that will be available. The framework analysis the trade-offs and choices that the nation confronts in addressing its reconstruction and development priorities. That clearly explained in this framework. The integration of gender analysis into the medium-term budget process goes beyond the analysis of impact, as it is linked to the governance principle of participation, which recognize that people are not only the ultimate beneficiaries of development but also agents of development. It relates to the need for participation in budgeting, that is the consultation and involvement of various stakeholders, including local government authorities, traditional rulers, civil society organizations, NGOs, community-based organizations and donor agencies in the process where development objectives are quantified and operationalized fiscally. This evolving notion of participative budgets, although limited in the development of medium-term frameworks, it's being promoted through the involvement of beneficiaries and affected groups in the design and implementation of policy programs and projects. So, like beneficiaries, they actively participate in designing and implementation of policies, decentralization of financial authority and the empowerment of local communities and cooperation with key stakeholders. I could able to give a South African example for this. In South Africa, a government invited members of the Women's Budget Initiative to address the workshop on the development of the 1996 medium-term expenditure framework. The idea was to plan expenditure on 3-year rolling basis rather than an existing year-by-year rolling basis. It is noteworthy that while this did not mean that the medium-term expenditure framework would necessarily be gender sensitive, it did signal a willingness by the Ministry of Finance to engage with gender equity issues. In fact, the National Expenditure Survey produced by the Ministry of Finance in 1999 did incorporate more gender analysis. In Tanzania, the Ministry of Finance is seeking to integrate gender concerns into the new medium-term expenditure finance and performance budgeting system. The sixth tool with regard to implementation of gender budgeting process is the gender-aware budget statement. This needs to be made by the specific government. The gender-aware budget statement is a government report that reviews the budget using some of the above tools. Like so far we have discussed 5 tools. They can use one of these tools, and based on the tools, they could able to provide gender-aware budget statement and summarize its implications for gender equality with different indicators such as the share of expenditure targeted to gender equality, gender balance in government jobs, contracts or training, or the share of public service expenditure used mainly by women. These are the some of the references. Based on these references, I have prepared this entire lecture. So, like for example, any government, like whether it's in any part of the world, any government, they could able to use one of these tools, like for example, gender-aware medium-term economic policy framework, or like the cells disaggregated analysis and the impact of gender budget on time use. Like they could able to use like tool 3, that is gender disaggregated beneficiary assessments. Like tool 2 is gender disaggregated public expenditure incidence analysis, and then first tool is gender aware policy appraisal. Any government, they could able to use any one of these tools. Based on the tools, they could able to prepare the budget, and same budget can be presented in the parliament, and they could able to ensure that the particular government, the government is sensitive towards addressing the gender issues. Using any one of these tools, they could able to prepare the budget, and whatever they are spending on particular programs, they already assess what kind of impact it could able to create on male, and what kind of impact it could able to create on female. Based on that assessment, using various indicators, they are design this budget. This is called the gender aware budget statement. Hope you have understood all these 6 tools. In the next lecture, we could able to learn more about gender auditing and gender budgeting. These are the references. If you are interested more to study about these tools, please go through these references and read more about that. If you have any doubts, you are welcome to write to the course coordinator. Thank you so much for listening this lecture. Thank you.